Good morning. Today is May 11th, 2015, and my name is David Graham. I'm a volunteer with the American Red Cross, and I'm here with Joe Roy Urice, a veteran of World War II. This interview is being conducted on behalf of the Veterans History Project and will be submitted to the Library of Congress. This interview is taking place in Joe's home in Kerrville, Texas. With us today is Dorothy Sisson, the friend of Joe. Joe, for the record, please state your full name, the date and place of birth.
I'm Joe Roy Urice. I was born in Falls Valley, Oklahoma, which is Garvin County on the Washita River. My birth date was March 1st, 1924, and I was born in the hospital there in town.
Joe, let's start the interview at a point before the war really gets cranking. What was your high school days kind of like?
Well, I'll have to say this, they were mixed up. I went to 3 different high schools going through the 10th, 11th, and 12th grades. One was, I started in the 10th grade in 1940. I scratched that. Anyway, I started as a sophomore in Elk City, Oklahoma in the 10th grade, and in mid-semester of my junior year, I transferred to Hobart, Oklahoma High School, and for my senior year, I transferred into Taft, Texas for my entire senior year.
Mm-hmm. What was your favorite subject in school?
I enjoyed, I think the teacher in a lot of cases made the difference. In Elk City, I thought I had some special teachers. There was a lady named Gowdy that taught not only Latin but geometry. That was very, very rewarding. I had a man called Terry Guest who taught mathematics, very special man. I had a band director called Court Flint who was very special and built up a fantastic band there in Elk City.
Was this a place where you met Dorothy?
Yes. She also played in the band. We were in the same social group at the time.
Yeah.
The small towns had their little groups that had compatible interests and compatible friendships.
Yeah, absolutely. December the 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, we declare war. You're still in high school.
No.
No?
I graduated from high school in May of 1941.
Okay.
So I was at the University of Texas in December.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah. And what were you pursuing at UT at that point?
I was just taking general courses. They prescribed pretty much what you took in those days, which was English and other subjects. I intended to be originally an engineer when I first went down there.
Mm-hmm.
And as a consequence, I immediately got a deferment. I hadn't even registered for the draft by December 7th. Mm-hmm. I was too young. I was still 17. And but when I did register, they gave me an exemption because I was in engineering school already at the university. Your question was, what did I know about December 7th? Is what you're...
Well, trying to see if some people that it's a very stark memory for them, and they knew where they were. And
I've read that exactly. I know these specific moments in time that most all of us have about various events, and that wasn't one of them in my case.
Yeah.
I was in a large boarding house there with 25 men, and I didn't even know that about Pearl Harbor till the next day, which would be a Monday.
Mm-hmm.
I went to my 1 o'clock English class, and the teacher there, Joseph Jones, who was another special educator, asked the class what did they think about the Pearl Harbor attack. And I knew nothing about it at that point. At 1 o'clock on Monday was my first recollection or knowledge that we had been bombed. But everybody else seemed to have a very specific moment, but I didn't have that.
Yeah. Did you feel the urge to join up right then?
I didn't have that. Really, I wasn't. I didn't have that urge to go do anything. And I read so many stories that guys would rush through their enlistment thing, and within 2 or 3 days they'd be signed up.
Mm-hmm.
One reason or another, I didn't do that.
Yeah. Did you stay at University of Texas until
I stayed in the University of Texas till the summer of 1943.
Mm-hmm.
And during that time, just prior to going to Texas University, after I graduated, I had some background in oil well drilling, and so through my father's influence, I got a job at Starr County, Texas, in the Rincon field, and I worked that summer to get enough money to go to school, plus with my family's help, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But I made enough money to be comfortable at the school. And so then in the fall of 1941, September of 41, I did enroll at the University of Texas, and of course in those days the fees, tuition fees, were next to nothing. I think $15 or something like that. And while I was there, I immediately got into the Texas University Band and was able to participate in that.
What instrument did you play?
Clarinet.
Clarinet. So at some point, did you attempt to go down and enlist?
No, I had no urge to do that. But of course, those were strange times. As times wore on, you began to feel a little bit of a misfit, if you will, if you weren't in the military and whatnot. And I think that's what eventually caused me to just drop out of the university in the summer of '43 and decide to go into the armed forces.
Mm-hmm. And I understand there was a lot of misinformation back then about whether to enlist or to draft, and whether you get into the Air Corps. And
well, what I had mentioned, I think, was that I had dropped out or had stopped going to school, and with the idea that I would enlist. And then I talked to my draft board, and they said, well, don't do that. Said, you'll get a chance to go into the Air Force as soon as you get down there, and you tell them that's what you want in. Said, just hang in and we'll draft you and go on. So as a consequence, I ended up being drafted rather than enlisted, and that was bad. That was actually a bad piece of advice in the long run, because later on, when I was in cadets at Luke Field, there was a decision made in March of 1944 by the military Secretary of the Army, I guess it was, that they had enough or more than they wanted cadets in the training to be officers, flying officers. Mm-hmm. So what they did was make a ruling that everybody who had volunteered into the Air Force directly got to stay in cadets, and the ones that were drafted and changed over to the Air Force were no longer in cadets. So it made an important decision in my life. So I was taken out of cadets and put into an enlisted position. It was a very fundamental change that I had no control over, which again was the Army rule of convenience of the government.
Mm-hmm. So you got your order to report. Where was that?
First of all, we were sent to Austin, Texas, to be examined to make sure that they wanted us physically, on a physical basis. And after we did that, we were picked up on a bus, a Greyhound bus that went from Corpus Christi to Austin, and they stopped in my little town of Taft and picked up several of us, including one guy that had a broken leg. Of course, he was immediately rejected because he had been in a motorcycle accident. But we went up there and passed the physical, or were examined for a physical. Approximately, I don't remember the dates, then we were again picked up by a Greyhound bus and taken into Fort Sam Houston at San Antonio. And that's where we were sworn into the Army.
Okay. Did that become your location for basic training?
Yes. Well, no. We in my particular case, I spent probably close to 3 weeks there before I was sent to basic training, which went then to Amarillo Army Airfield in Amarillo, Texas. And that's where I took basic training.
Was it just the same basic training everybody takes in boot camp, or was it more directed?
Well, it was
towards...
Army, so I'm sure it was a very close facsimile of it. I have no way of comparing, but we would be taken out with long marches and physical activity, PT, some class work, some. It was more to brainwash us in a way to Army discipline more than anything else, in my opinion, at this point.
Yeah. So 3 weeks in basic, is that right?
No, the 3 weeks in the induction center at Fort Sam Houston.
Oh, okay.
And then I don't remember without rethinking it how many weeks we went through basic. But after we left base, at that point I might mention the Amarillo Airfield was also a training ground for Air Force mechanics, and their main engine that they worked on, the main airplane they worked on, was B-17s. So it was that school produced a lot of the ground crew mechanics. So after we left Amarillo, went by train to Luke Field, Arizona, and close to Phoenix, and we were housed there with a large barracks full of other cadets, and were put to work on the flight line, and to just do some. We were probably just in a holding pattern for the next move, which was to actually go to school for a cadet indoctrination program that they had at that time. But we were in, I guess, a holding pattern there at Luke, because all they asked us to do was help out on the flight field out there, helping service AT-6 training planes. The AT-6 was a trainer of that time. AT-6 AT-6 Texan, as they called it.
Mm-hmm. I know that plane.
Yep. Can you cut it here? I want My throat's dry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Can we have a signal or something where I can just say, let's stop a minute?
Yeah.
My throat is just getting raspy.
We're going to take a little break here.
Well,
Hold
if you don't mind,
Okay, we're back after a little short break here, and you're at Luke Field.
yes, we were at Luke Field for just a few weeks, mainly, as I said, put on the flight line to help service the airplanes there more than anything else. One morning they called us out at breakfast time and said, well, we've got some major changes we want to make. Said, those of you who are on this list are no longer in cadets, and then those of you that are on another list. And those of you who are not on the cadet list anymore will be treated as privates, if you will, instead of cadets, which was a different nomenclature.
Sure.
We were given a sheet while we're standing out there in the open. Said you've got three options. You can choose to go to engine school, or to armament school, to radio school, or four options, or to gunnery school. And without much more explanation of that, we were handed a sheet for us to check off our preference, and we had no real knowledge of what was happening or why we were no longer in cadets or anything else. So just in my mind, I said, well, I'll just go immediately into gunnery school. So I was one of about 13 people that chose that out of, we probably had a barracks of, I don't know, 100 people, I don't know. At this point, there were two, is a double level barracks, so sizable. So we were put on a Pullman car that was just coach car the next day. And in our case, this Pullman thing had to be from the 1880s period. It was that old. They'd no doubt, railroad was hard pressed to keep up with all their demands in those days. And we went by railroad from Phoenix to Needles, California was the turnaround point, and then we doubled back into Las Vegas, which at that time was called Las Vegas Army Airfield. It's now Nellis. We were assigned to a group of people and put through that gunnery school practice, which amounted to classwork, and it amounted to a lot of skeet shooting and a lot of acquainting with a 50 caliber machine gun. We did only one time shoot a 30 caliber on the range on the ground. One time we later into the program we were taken up in a B-17 for about a couple of hours, if you will, and we were allowed to shoot out of the waist gun at a target pulled by an AT-6, a tow target. And so that was the extent of our air flying at the time. Break.
Yeah. Well, go ahead. Have a glass of water here. So you'd had some 50 caliber training down on the ground, and then you were then given some opportunity to fire a 50 caliber
one time
at a target in the air.
Yeah, it was a tow target.
Yeah. Did you hit it?
Oh, well, there was no way we'd ever know.
Just the way it was.
It was just being able to. Am I on there?
Yeah.
There was no way of knowing, and we weren't graded on that in any way. I think it was an opportunity to see if, to just give us some background on what it was to fire a gun out of an airplane. Because the training before that had been a lot of flashcard training to teach us the various airplanes we might see, and they were being very general because they were showing Japanese planes as well as German planes. So there was no specific training towards a given theater.
Mm-hmm.
The major emphasis, it seemed, was to teach us how to clean and operate and a 50 caliber machine gun. And one of the requirements was, and to better train us about the gun, was a program that we had to take a 50 caliber machine gun apart blindfolded and put it back together blindfolded, so just by feel. That training all was pretty useless, really, in hindsight of many years, because if you're up in the airplane and very cold position, you're not going to be able to take a machine gun apart and do anything with it other than just some very basic things.
Mm-hmm.
So, but of course that was part of the training. A lot of the other training we had was to shoot skeet, and because there was a very specific flight pattern that a airplane had to take in order to shoot at your own plane. So it's like leading birds in when in flight. When you're shooting, you have to give it so much lead, and that was one of the things they tried to instill in everybody. While I was there at Las Vegas, there were a few of us, probably 20 of us, somehow or another got scarlet fever. And all of a sudden one day we just kind of collapsed, and they took my bunch that were sick to the hospital, and we were given at that time sulfa as the cure for that sort of thing, and we were kept in the hospital there at that base for 3 weeks in my case.
Mm-hmm.
I left there approximately the 1st of August 1944, and we were given a 10-day delay en route to go home if we could, but to go to our assigned crew assembly points.
Mm-hmm.
In my case, my little hometown was right on the road to Tampa, Florida, so I was able to go into my hometown and visit the family for a few days, and before I had to reload and go back into Tampa for a crew assignment.
Okay. So your crew assignment did occur in Tampa.
That's correct. And I might mention, just for the sake of things, when I was there, my dad was in charge of about 8 or 10 rigs for a company called the Fane Drilling Company. And at that point, he was out of town up close to Victoria, Texas, because one of the wells he was supervising was blowing out. So I went up there to visit with him. That's the only chance I got to see him before going overseas. And that well, which Gulf Coast in those days had a very highly charged gas system,
Pressure.
Areas in there, and without very careful control they could blow out. In this case it did. But back to the point I was going to make. Since between my senior year in high school and my freshman year in Texas, I had roughnecked in the oil field and had some previous experience also. And then in the summer of 1942, I went down to Bay City, Texas, and roughnecked on a drilling rig there. So I had some experience in that way, and it was rather unusual because the British had a department that was interested in bringing some rigs from America over to England to drill some wells so they could have some stability in oil production, which they highly needed. They had little or none at the time, and they came to two companies, which was Fain Drilling Company of Oklahoma City and Noble Drilling Company of Tulsa, Oklahoma, with the idea that they would take perhaps as many as 10 new rigs over to England with crews and whatnot to drill wells in a given spot over there. My father was supposed to be in charge of that, and so he had asked me, did I want to be part of that unit? And this is before I went into the military, of course. I said, sure, that'd be interesting to do that. Well, oddly enough, about that time, the head of the Fain Drilling Company, Leslie Fain, died suddenly, and so Noble Drilling Company became the lead contractor and sent the rigs over. So that was another Y in the road that I didn't take, which have been very interesting. And there is a history of that group that went over, and they did drill around 100 wells in the Nottingham Forest, just north of Nottingham. And one of the men that was taken over there, who happened to be from Oklahoma, he was killed in an accident there, and he's buried now in the cemetery at just out of Cambridge, the American military.
I've been to that.
I thought it was strictly for military, but not necessarily. They tell me there are around 32, if I remember the number correctly, civilians actually buried there.
It's a beautiful cemetery.
Beautiful cemetery. So anyway...
so it's August 44, you're at Crew Assembly Point in Pampa.
Correct.
And who's your crew?
Well, oddly enough, it took some time to put the crew together, and I don't know the logistics of how they selected that. I'm sure it was more than just assembly line deal. Naturally, they needed specific types on each crew. The pilot, of course, was the one they built each crew around, and then they assigned. Apparently, there was very little control left to the individual pilots as to whom they got. It was more of a local procedure that they went through to assign people. So he was assigned at that time, and his name was Jesse Wofford from Drew, Mississippi, and later Jackson, Mississippi. He was assigned a co-pilot named Kenneth Carr from Chicago, Illinois. He was assigned a navigator from Long Island named Leonard Fruman, who is still living. He was assigned a bombardier whose name I have no recollection of at this point. He was assigned, in fact, we did not have a bombardier, I beg your pardon. We had a toggelier, as they called him, and he came out of armament school. His name was Carl Lindstrom from Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was assigned a radio man, Ruben Lasco from Long Island, New York also. These people had gone through specific school for that training. Lowry Field, in the case of the armament guy, he also had a engineer and top turret gunner named Algie Davenport from Rossville, Georgia, assigned to his crew. And then there were 3 other gunners, including myself, who went to the tail. We had a gunner in the ball turret named Raymond Euler, who was from Wooster, Ohio, and we had a waist gunner called Norman Bowman from Minneapolis, Minnesota. So we, after about 3 weeks there at Tampa itself, we were assigned to a crew and then sent to a mid-Florida field called Avon Park, Florida. Avon Park was right in the middle of Florida, if you will, somewhat south of Orlando. So we went through training then as a crew at that point, starting at that point.
Okay. Joe, why did you get the tail gun?
I don't know that there were any specific reasons, except normally they would put the smallest man in the ball turret because it is really a confined place, and usually they would put the larger man in the waist. And so I was in the middle, if you will. I was 5'10" at that time, and the other guys were larger or smaller than I. So I don't know that there was any magic about it other than just eeny, meeny, miny, moe and throw a dart at the chart.
Yeah, the tail gun's a pretty lonely place, huh?
I had no problem with it. I've been asked that question many times. Wasn't it tight and confining, and didn't you feel lonely back there? I never had that feeling. I was quite comfortable back there. I was quite athletic in those days, and I had room to navigate, maneuver, and I didn't have a problem with it.
Yeah. So you're finally beginning to work as a crew?
Yes, we made a lot of training flights. We flew every day, it seemed to me, in retrospect, someplace, because each person needed to be acquainted with his position and the flight environment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what that was all about, really. We flew all over different parts of Florida. Lake Okeechobee was one of the big points that was a reference point. Of course, you could see that from anywhere. It was south of our base. We had, besides the navigation training and the pilot training and flying and whatnot, we had some air-to-ground shooting for us gunners opportunities. Not a great deal of it, but some, and we would shoot up a range of where there was nothing out there in this Florida area.
Mm-hmm.
We had one event that stuck in my mind very much. We had gone to Avon Park about September 1st, 1944, and about a month after we were there, maybe give or take, there was a not tornado, but a hurricane was supposed to come through that area, and they moved all the planes from Avon Park to Hunter Field to get them out of the path.
Mm-hmm.
But they left all of us personnel flying through back at the base. That shows where the priority of the Army
plane's
was.
important, but there too.
They could replace the men, but not the planes. So that was a rather interesting thought. Another thing, I didn't run across many people that I knew prior to going into the Army. I didn't run across many people when I was in the Army. But right after I got to Avon Park, I was hailed out in the middle of a field there as going back to my barracks, and this guy said, "Hey, aren't you Joe Urice?" And I said, "Well, yeah." I looked at him. I didn't know who he was necessarily, and finally realized he was the drum major of a band in Elk City. And he was there, and I don't know what his permanent job was, but he told me he was also leading another little band there on the field there. So that was the one opportunity to meet a person that I knew from my past. But we did a lot of training, and we got to know each other as individuals right there at that field. And I thought that was so important, because to me, the spirit de corps that you developed in those times of flying and flying and flying, that was very, very important. And of course, you're living shoulder to shoulder with all enlisted men, and we were barracked. We were housed in a tar paper shack barracks, single floor, and we were the only crew in there. So I don't know where they kept most of the other people, but that's where we were. But we did have a fantastic opportunity to get to know each other and depend on each other. And to me, that is extremely important, because I saw crews that came in other times over in England that they'd just been thrown together at the last minute, and they had no feeling for who the other person was or anything else. That to me would be hard to fly, because one of the strengths, as far as I was concerned, was that I knew everybody and they knew what I could do and I knew what they could do, and we could depend on each other.
Joe, in that regard, you were a tail gunner, but did you cross-train in other positions?
Oh, I knew how to do all the turrets. Yeah, that was one of the things we learned at Las Vegas. We did training in all the turrets, the ball turret, the top turret, all those various places. Yes, we could have gone in any direction from gunnery. Yes.
Who backed up the radio man?
We didn't have a backup radio man.
So
no, I've heard and read of these guys who are assistant radio men, and I don't know how they could have been assistant when they had no training in it, but it was the terminology they had and that sort of thing. I don't understand. The program didn't make sense to me.
Yeah. So you're trained up? Y'all are ready to go?
Yeah, I might mention one thing that still is a vivid thing in my memory while we were at Avon Park. Well, a couple of things. One day I had developed either a severe sinus situation or a bad cold or something, and my head was really stopped up and all that. And I asked the pilot, said, "Hey, can I not fly today?" I said, I'm really stopped up. He said, "No, you better go and go." Well, that was the day he tried to take the plane up to the highest altitude he could, which was 31,000 feet. And my head, in flying in unpressurized cabins, you had to be very careful about your eardrum pressures and whatnot. Well, when you've got a cold, you cannot release that pressure. No way. So we went to 31,000 feet that day, and all that time we came down, and boy, my head was hurting coming down because that pressure was building up. And when we landed, all of a sudden, instantaneously at the bump or whatever we hit, my ears released and went shoo, just like that. And I just feel very fortunate I didn't lose eardrums or something that particular day, but I didn't, and so I still have good hearing, and I feel very fortunate that wasn't the major problem for me. The other thing I might mention, Avon Park was a very small town, and I don't know the population of it at the time, but I would guess 4,000, whatever, from a native population. Nice little rural town. But one of the places that we as a crew went when we got a pass was to the Blue Lagoon, which was on a lake right there out of town, and we could go in and have a drink and whatnot. And so the four of us nearly always went together, which were Lindstrom and Lasco, myself, and Lindstrom, and Bowman, excuse me. So we were in this Blue Lagoon one night. Rube, who was a sharp guy, Rube Blasco, said, said, if we all come back from this deal after the war, said, I'm going to throw us the biggest party you ever saw, and said, I'm going to write it down right on this little Social Security card he had in his pocket, and we all signed it. Well, it never happened, but it was one of those fundamental fun things that crews do that never happen. I thought that was an interesting part of our spirited corps that developed our friendship that lasted forever until even now. Then to continue on, we finally finished our training at Avon Park, excuse me, and we were transferred for about 2 weeks up to Hunter Field in Georgia, which is out of Savannah, Georgia, and we spent 2 weeks there, I'm sure with a lot of other similar crews, in which we picked up new flying equipment and flying clothes, including flying overalls, parkas, flying jackets, pants, all this sort of equipment. This was a departure from the days that they're seen in so many movies where everybody was given a leather A2 flying jacket and whatnot. We were never issued those. The point that I want to make about Hunter Field was that somebody in that barracks was a thief deluxe, because so many people in that barracks got robbed during the night, and they would have their wallets or something in their pillow or anything else, and they would just disappear. And a case of that happened one night there at our barracks, because we had our flying clothes hanging up on the wall because no other place to put them, of course, just hooks on the wall, if you will. And this one guy got robbed, and everybody said, well, where is, who did it, what? When we, and I'm jumping forward just to show a point, when we were flying overseas, our waist gunner put on his flying clothes because it was getting a little chilly and everything. He reached down his pocket, and I was right there beside him. And he reached down his pocket, and there was a billfold. And I saw this bewildered look on his face. It wasn't his, and he didn't know where it came from and everything else. That thief had evidently stolen it from one person and then emptied it, put it in the flying clothes that were hanging close by, and drifted out somehow. And there was very little theft in my experience going on among the flying people, but they were targets because they were just transient people going through, and that was one of the places that I saw obvious theft. And there was another obvious theft at Iceland, but other than that, I never saw obvious theft again. To continue on, we got our pictures made there as a crew at Hunter Field, and pictures made as a crew, meaning that there was a contract company that was given the opportunity to do that, and I think we had to pay $10 for our copy of the print, and we ended up with 2 copies in 2 different poses in each case. And The period we spent there at Hunter was limited because after the pilot, we didn't do any flying as a crew there except for the pilot because he was issued a plane which he had to sign for, a brand new B-17G. He had to sign for, and of course the pilot and the co-pilot and then the navigator took it out for an instrument check and realigned the compasses and that sort of thing. But the rest of us didn't fly in that 2-week period. We then took that plane and flew to Gunnery Field in New Hampshire, which was just an overnight stay. And then we flew from there to Goose Bay, Labrador, and landed there. And it was a big base, of course, for sending planes on to Europe. We got snowed in there for about 2 weeks and couldn't leave. This was in December of '44 that we were in Labrador. And we got snowed in, as I say, for 2 weeks, and I spent most of my time. It was rather interesting because, again, we got to know each of the crew very, very well. The crew being the enlisted man. We had very little contact with our officers. The guys from the north, they were able to check out ice skates and go out and on the local ponds and ice skate. Well, we'd never heard of that down south and didn't even want to try. And but one of the games that we learned, oddly enough, from those northern guys was cribbage. And that stuck with me from now on, was the game of cribbage. Never heard of it before. All my spare time during that period was actually spent at the gym because I just loved sports, and basketball was one of my main interests. And several of us from different crews would go over there every day and play basketball there all day long, if you will. You know, just pick up basketball. Mm-hmm. Then one work exercise we had to do was the pilot asked us to go out there and clean the snow off the airplane we had, and which we did as a enlisted man crew. And one morning then we were assigned then to fly overseas when the weather finally cleared, and in individual planes we would take off for Reykjavik, Iceland. And I remember we flew over the tip of, we didn't go cross over Greenland, but we see the tip of it as we flew, because we were not on altitude or anything. We just somewhere at the medium height, below 10,000 feet. And that was the point, as I said, that Boy Scudder Bowman reached in his pocket and found this stolen billfold. Mm-hmm. But we flew in then to Reykjavik and stayed all right there. And a few of the guys had some whiskey with them and that sort of thing, and it was left on the plane at night, and that all disappeared during the night. So I say that's a second point of theft that I knew personally about. We didn't stay there, but as I say, overnight, and then we boarded the plane again and went on a flight to the north of Ireland, and then flew down the Irish Sea to a point in northwest Wales called the RF Valley Field, and landed there. We then went to it was dark by the time we got there, and they had a canteen we went to and got a little food. But one of the things we also got that was vivid in my mind, they had a big urn of creamed tea there rather than coffee. Maybe they had coffee there, I don't know. But I took the tea, And that was the best tasting stuff I'd ever tasted, I thought. And I got hooked on British tea from there on for a long time. But we were assigned to another empty barracks again, in which we were given 3 what they call biscuits, which were about 30 inches, probably square, for mattresses, and then 2 light RAF blankets, colored blue, by the way, and sent over to this ice cold barracks. And boy, that was the coldest night I've been into a long time. But we got on, and then the next morning they put us on a train to go into Stone, England, which was another reassignment center. And the plane then was had all the sleeping bags, all the ice goggles, all that special equipment that we took over were taken, and the pilot was given a receipt for it again. So the Army was signing the pilot in and out for all that equipment.
Wow.
But nevertheless, on that flight also they had a huge drum in the center of the bomb bay. And at that point I thought that was probably extra gasoline for our flight over. Now I realized they didn't need extra gasoline for that particular flight. It was probably just a means of getting more gasoline over to England, because it was a huge thing. It filled up the whole bomb bay. But nobody said at the time what it was. But it always stuck in my mind, well, what is that stuff? We went to Stone, and we only stayed there a couple of nights before we were assigned to a bomb group. But one of the specific things that I have always considered an oddity was we went to the mess hall, and we being flying people, we didn't have canteens, we didn't have mess kits, and we didn't have any of that sort of thing. And they expected us to, because evidently it was a reassignment place for a lot of ground troop too. They expected us to have our own canteen cup, which we didn't. They had no cups, anything else, and I thought that I still find that startling and amazing that they had nothing for us to drink from. The next time I went to the barracks, to the mess hall, well, this permanent party guy said, well, you want to take my canteen cup up and use it? And I said, sure. I said, otherwise I won't get anything to drink. So I remember that kindness with that guy. Never have seen him before or since. So we then were put on a train, and one of the places we went through was on the train trip. We were assigned to the 100th Bomb Group, apparently, and we were to go to a railroad station called Dis, which was over in East England, approximately 60 to 70 miles north of London, and was the closest railroad station to our new base, which was Thorpe Abbott's number 139 in Army RAF literature. And we went by Cambridge going into Dis, as I recall. The transportation unit at the base had some 6x6 trucks out there to take us to the base. As I say, this was in December 1944, and there was no cover on it, nothing else, and we nearly froze to death that trip into the base that night, trying to make that short trip into the base. We were immediately assigned to a barracks there on the 351st Squadron at that time, and that's the barracks I stayed in nearly all the time that I was on the 100th Bomb Group site.
So do you remember the date in which you arrived?
We arrived 29th of December 1944.
Good. So you spent New Year's at
I had no recollection of New Year's or anything else. I had always, as I went along to these various bases, I would keep a little notebook that I had, little leather notebook, and I would show the base and the dates that came and the dates I left and that sort of thing. So that's how I was able to keep up in my crew history I wrote as to the exact times and whatnot. But holidays, Christmas, I have no recollection of, which we had to be at Stone, England at the time. If it was Christmas, I didn't know it. In hindsight, I didn't know it was New Year's Eve. In hindsight, any of that sort of thing, that wasn't important to us. It just, we were in transit. We were really in these strange new quarters. We were seeing strange things, new things. The reason I remember specifically about the 31st of December, though, was that was the day that our group flew a mission to Hamburg, Germany.
That's your first mission?
No. The group flew a mission.
Okay.
We weren't released for missions yet.
Okay.
We had to go through a training program first. But we'd been on the base 2 days there, and they sent a mission to Hamburg. And on that particular day, they lost 12 planes. And one of the, to back up a moment, in our barracks we were assigned, there was another crew there. There were 12 enlisted men in each end of this barracks. Two flying crews, in other words, of enlisted men. And so we hounded these people and got our bunks and whatnot, and more or less just said hello to them. And they were on that mission to Hamburg on the 31st and got shot down. Oh, we didn't know the names, we didn't know the crew, we didn't know who they were, but about 5 o'clock, if you will, that afternoon, the first sergeant by the name of the 351st Squadron came in, B-A-U-M-A-N, and he started taking all the things that were belonging to
Personal
the other, everything, the biscuits for the mattresses, the blankets, the clothes, everything out of the foot locker, and he would just jam them in this so-called sack we used for a mattress cover. And in each case, he carried 5 men's things off, and didn't say a word, just gathered it off and left. We didn't know that they'd gone down until after the fact, so to speak. But that was our introduction, if you will, to the war. That people could be there one day and gone the next. That crew I later developed was Clifton Williams' crew, but I didn't know that at the time. There was another oddity involved with that particular crew. I hope I can remember his name. There was a man on that particular crew in that barracks that had, for some reason or other, been taken out of navigation school on graduation day and made a enlisted man gunner. Now what he did I've never heard, but he evidently must have told the colonel what to do or something, because they busted him out of navigation school, and I thought I never would forget that man's name. But he had the bunk in one of the quarters there. He was taken off that crew just prior to that Hamburg mission and replaced by another man, and he didn't get shot down. He had been taken off by Harry Kruger, the CO of the 351st, and to be reassigned as a navigator on another crew. So he was a flying master sergeant as an enlisted man.
Mm-hmm.
And I doubt if there were too many that had that experience.
Yeah.
The name probably come to me in the middle of the night, but I know it very well. So anyway, we from there on, we had various mechanical things that we went through. They would take us into a room, and one of the early briefing missions we had was by a major named Rosenthal, and he gave us a general update on what the system would be as to what we would be doing as a flying crew, and be given briefings before missions and that sort of thing. I don't remember the gist of his message, but it was a couple hours of in-house speaking. He was one of the legends of our group. He ended up flying 51 missions, which was he'd asked and stayed over after he'd finished his own missions. He became a legend in his own time. The other things that I recall we did in that early briefing was we had our pictures taken for the purpose that if we were shot down, we would have these pictures to give to the French or the German resistance and everything, so they could possibly make identifying passports for us in case. So we had a half a dozen of those we were given, and not in uniform, but with fake civilian clothes. Those pictures, what we would do was stick our head through a little hole, and it would show us in civilian clothes. So I'm sure you've seen those various things in carnivals and whatnot, but that's what they did, the photo op people did, to give us pictures. They also issued us smaller than a dime compasses, and we probably were given 6 of those apiece, and we would put those in various hiding places in our uniforms and whatnot, so we'd have them with us on a flight in case we needed them if we got shot down. So they were trying to prepare us for the possibility.
Mm-hmm.
And we went through various training. It was more of a reacquainting process than anything else. They had a gunnery barracks there, and they took us all there one half day, and we showed them we knew how to operate a turret and what a gun would look like and all that sort of thing. And no big deal. It was just running us through the process. In the meantime, we flew nearly every day in a ability to acquaint the pilot and the navigators and whatnot with the local areas and the radio beams and the systems and how to locate the field and that sort of thing. And we flew nearly every day for about 2 weeks. And then one day we were assigned to go on a mission, and we went to Mainz, Germany, which was situated on the Rhine River, and our target that day was a bridge they were trying to knock out. And I don't know the results of that thing, but
that was your first mission?
That was our first mission. MAINZ was our first mission. And we didn't see any fighters from our plane that day. So I can't speak to having fighter in position, but we had a lot of flak over the target. And the odd thing about it, as I recall now, of course we'd land and we'd be debriefed and given a shot of whiskey out of what they call a solo cup, which was one of those flat little paper cups that maybe some people are acquainted with. And then we'd be debriefed by the intelligence officers there. And NASCAR we'd seen, which was true of all the crews. We weren't unique in that situation.
What was your ability to see it from the tail?
It's an interesting question. The tail in a B-17 changed as all B-17s were upgraded naturally over the period of the war. They started out with a tail section that had very limited, in my opinion, visibility. It was a tighter area from a visibility point. They were in the process and had already put most planes in the air that had what they call the Cheyenne tail, which was more of a turret and a larger visibility area. And it really opened up the visibility from my standpoint, because I felt I could see more than 180 degrees in every direction, side, up, down, and all this sort of thing. But those early tails, which were common for the later, well, for the B-17F and the early B-17G, which were on the same specifications, were different. And those glasses, that glass inside my tail, were very susceptible to freezing inside with ice at altitude.
All moisture flowing through the plane.
Oh, well, yeah, we were in the tail. You just like in a funnel. All the wind came funneling right through the tail and out, and so I had a constant breeze. I thought constantly. But my point being that on those first two missions, we were, of course, tailing Charlie and getting the older planes and everything else, which was common practice in those days. And I'd get up at altitude and my windows would freeze up and turn the ice up. And I would have to figure out how to scrape that off, not having anything of consequence to do that and whatnot. And it was a real problem on those first
Didn't
two
have any
missions.
credit cards back in those days. Huh?
Well, we didn't have anything that I could use per se for scraping. And I remember coming back to the barracks that night, and a crew that had been moved into our barracks was the Brown crew. And I asked the tail gunner there, I said, how do you overcome that? Because evidently he had experienced some of that too. He said, go to the mess hall and get you a lemon and cut it in half, and you can rub that on those windows, and that will help prevent that icing up. Well, that's what I did on the second mission, and that did help, but it was a real problem on icing up. But at any rate, one thing I wanted to say in regard to that series of missions we started, it was rather odd that our crew, after we got back on the ground and been debriefed, we never talked about missions again while we were at the 100th. It just was a no-no subject.
Not even crew to crew, huh?
We didn't talk with the other crews to speak of other than our own guys in the barracks. Anyway, we were a unit within ourselves, if you will, and that's the way we'd been trained, and that's the way we stayed.
Your particular airplane sounded like you might have changed planes several times.
We did. In those days, the new crews weren't assigned a plane as had been the practice in earlier days.
Right.
The earlier days, they would be assigned a crew, and they'd put
One plane.
They'd be assigned an airplane, and they'd have their own crew chief, and they'd go out there and paint nose art names on them, and that was a big deal, and continues to this day. The nose art names seemed to be important to historians all over England and America. But we didn't get one assigned to us, being one of the new crews at the time, and we would fly a different plane. In fact, our third mission we had one of the newer B-17s with a Cheyenne tail in it, so I'm sure it had other improvements too in other parts of the plane. But we had to take the older planes as the new guy in the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Did you eventually get a permanent plane?
Never did. We never flew. Basically, whatever was available was what would happen. They kept a ready board, if you will, in the engineering offices and whatnot, showing the situation of each airplane as to its flying time on the engines and the condition and if it was available to fly or not. So when a mission would come up, they would say, well, we got this plane, that plane, and those of you that didn't have a specific plane were assigned to something that was available.
Mm-hmm.
So we flew several different planes. Some of them had names. It wasn't important to me anyway as to what their name was, and I never kept a record of it. But since that time, I knew that we flew in one called the White Cargo, and there were others, but at the time it really wasn't important to us because we didn't have a plane assigned to us.
Mm-hmm.
After my pilot was chosen to be a lead pilot, we also didn't have an assigned plane because there were about four, as I recall, planes that had the radar ball and device and equipment in it, and that was rotated among the crew that was going to lead a mission that particular day. So we would fly this or that one, depending on what was available. So no, we never did get a plane assigned to us. We had thought that we might name a plane if we ever got one, and had some discussion about that. And we came up with this phrase one time, and that originated from a little phrase our crew always were saying, well, okay, we're going to try one more mission, one more time. So one time got to be our phrase, and our pilot ended up getting his jacket painted with that name on it, and a good-looking girl, of course, on his A2 jacket. He got an A2 jacket, and that was so there was proof of that, and also that was written up in Ray Bowden's nose art book that he put out. He was an English historian, and he collected histories about nose art. And our one time, even though it was never painted on an airplane, got written up as such.
Mm-hmm.
Because he wrote me a letter once and asked the history of it, and I gave him this info, and he put it down as I told him.
You mentioned that one of you, at least one of your missions was over France. Do you want to share that?
Sure. That was in the later days of the war. It would be in April, the exact date escapes me, but 17, 18, something like that, 1945. Mm-hmm. They had a German unit that still maintained a position at Royan, R-O-Y-A-N, France, which was on the northwest point of France, and it had sufficient big guns to cause trouble with shipping there in the English Channel. And this, if I understand the history of the mission, the French government had asked that bombing raids be made on that particular location because it hadn't been overcome yet, and it was giving trouble for shipping. And so the 100th Bomb Group, I think, ended up flying 3 or 4 missions in a very short time to bomb out that particular unit. It was one of the first and only missions I flew on in which they dropped napalm. But that was I think, a political decision as much as anything else. That was about the next to last mission I think I flew.
Mm-hmm. How many missions total did you fly?
I didn't fly but 13 official missions.
Any unofficial?
Well, we aborted one that we didn't get a credit for, even though we were already joined up. And I'm not being negative about it. It's just the system. Seemed like there was another one someplace, but
Share a little bit, if you would, about your first mission over Berlin.
Berlin had always been a political and necessary target by the RAF for a long time, and continued to be a point of continued bombing throughout the war. The first mission that was flown by the 8th Air Force against Berlin by the 8th Air Force was early March 1944. Seemed like it was about March 4th, if I remember. The 95th Bomb Group was given official credit for being that unit, but there were a few planes with the 100th that had tagged along with them, and so they ran on that same first mission. And I'm digressing, though, just to give you some background. But Berlin continued to be a continued target of day and night bombing by the RAF and the 8th Air Force throughout the war. We went there ourselves as a crew on the February 3rd, 1945. The target at that time was supposed to be the marshalling yards, which they call the railroad system, because the intelligence had gathered that the 6th Panzer unit of the German army was passing through there on the way to from the west front to the east front to go against the Russians. So they had evidently targeted that as the objective of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it was there or not, I have no idea. But that was the point. We went over Berlin, of course, and it was a cleared point as we came into it. The area, the clouds had cleared out, and it was clear, and they had put up a complete barrage right over the target because they knew what we were headed for. And they had target barraged right over that target, and so that's what we had to fly into. That mission was...
This was flak you're talking about here.
Yes. Different kind of guns. They had 88s, they had 105s, there was a bigger gun. I think they had two, but they had bracketed that area. And so since we were later in the trail of planes groups, they had our altitude down exactly. And our lead squadron lost 4 planes immediately. And again, some of them survived and some of them didn't out of that, but they all went down. We were crippled up ourselves. They hit and dropped out of formation immediately and lost 2 engines, and flew back from Berlin on 2 engines on the way back. So
This was your plane?
That's our plane. We were in another squadron. We weren't in the lead squadron. We were in another one. But they still hit us and peppered us pretty good. So, fortunately, thank goodness, none of us were hit, but our plane was battered pretty badly.
In a situation like that where you only have two engines, do you have to drop your altitude pretty significantly?
That's what happened. Our pilot was losing. We immediately lost several thousand feet and fell out of formation just instantaneously.
Mm-hmm.
I almost hate to say this, but I looked around from my tail position and I saw no other planes. I said, "Hey, did they get everybody but us?" You know, that's how egotistical you might be at that situation. But all we'd done is just drop quite rapidly out of formation. And
Had you dropped your bomb load before
we
this?
had just dropped, yes. And of course, that's another point. Every time you drop bomb load, which was 5,000 pounds or whatever, you would get lift on your plane anyway, and that was a different kind of situation because we fell rather than lifted. But anyway, yes, I've talked to my pilot after the fact about that, and he said it was quite difficult for him to fly back because number one, we'd lost some gasoline. Number two, he was flying on two motors, on two out on each side. I mean, two of them on the same side. And so he had to trim the plane up, and it was quite difficult to keep it flying level. And of course, he had to, because of the less power, he had to bring it down. And we came down below 10,000 feet because we immediately went off oxygen. So I know he's below 10,000 feet. And he flew that thing back, which he ended up getting a DFC for because of his ability to bring it back. We flew out, and I have to give our navigator a great deal more credit than he's willing to accept because he took us out of Germany and missed all the flak zones that we had. So he was able to maneuver through there, and there we were at 10,000 feet and would have been ideal targets. But we never saw a bit of flak coming out. And he brought us out through to the west side of Heligoland Island, and we got into the North Sea there and then headed west into England then. And so we had that sort of situation. We were one of those planes that, because of the lack of power, we were dropping all the guns and the ammunition out. Excuse me.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, and as you...
we dropped all the ammunition and guns except for the top turret and the tail. We kept those turret guns, and we dropped out anything that was loose that we could drop out for weight purposes. Mm-hmm. Our radio man, I don't know if this was a fact or not, but I think it was one of his fun stories. He said, so I promptly threw my radio out there. I don't believe that story to this day. He swore it was true, but I know that wasn't true. So, but we had some fun people on our board.
Did y'all have heated flight suits?
We had evidently a excellent version of the flight suits. If I remember the history of it, and I never had them personally, there was a blue one-piece electric suit that was originally given to the crews because we were at severe temperatures up there. I didn't have anything to know this personally, but we were at minus 40 and minus 50, and at one flight we were told that we were minus 75 degrees below zero. So it was necessary that you keep all your bare parts covered up. And back to your electric suit question, they developed a new three-part suit that was more of a greenish color, as I recall. That was very effective, and we would plug that into our airplane's power for each man's suit, just like as we plugged in our own oxygen tube for our oxygen mask. We had our own electrical connection. I never heard of anybody in our crew that had a equipment failure on their suit. We would check them in each time at night after the mission, and as I understand them, they would be taken into a separate barrack, separate hut, equipment room, and hung out to dry, if nothing else. And I'm almost positive they would check them for the circuits. Surely that had to be one of the procedures, but I don't know that for a fact. So we had no power failures within our crew on any of our electrical suits, which would have been a very difficult problem.
Yeah. I'm sorry I took you off direction. You were getting your plane home with only 2 engines, and you have a navigator who helped you avoid
the navigator should have gotten a big, more than a pat on the back for his ability, in my opinion. Fruman was his name, as I've said before. But the only one that got a unusual credit for it was the pilot. After we cleared Heligoland, we headed west, of course, and there was some conversation specifically by our co-pilot that he wanted to say, because of our problems, let's go to the nearest land, which was Sweden. And the pilot overruled him totally and said, no, we're going to take it to England. And my understanding is that they radioed in what they expected, what the navigator expected his fuel system to take him to. And when we arrived at that point, and we were flying probably decreasing altitude all the time, I would assume we were somewhere close to 5,000 feet. And when we flew over that point that had been predicted, there were 4 of the, I guess, British naval patrol out there that their assignment was to pick up crews that had to abandon ship and whatnot. And that memory of them making a small circle out there in that immediate area still is very vivid in my mind to this day.
Wow.
But we made it on into England and on the gas we had and everything.
What about the landing?
Don't recall anything about it. Just really glad to get on the ground.
Yeah.
I remember that. Boy, what
I
a
just
relief!
know it.
What a relief! My pilot was, I thought, and still think and know, had to be an outstanding pilot because he was selected as a lead pilot in the first place, and they had to be chosen for that to lead squadrons. And he could land the plane. His depth perception must have been outstanding because he could land the plane so smoothly that I would land in the tail sometimes and never be bumped. So he was quite good in my opinion. He would practice flying all the time, I think, more than anything else. He told me once that after the fact, I made my son Scott, and I went up to a speech he gave at Jackson, Mississippi in 2007. And at that time I got to ask him some questions about what he did under certain circumstances. And one of the things he told me that when he became a lead pilot, we would go up and among one of the things that we trained to do, he said one of the things I wanted to do was be able to fly my plane with just the trim tabs. He said, I know that every move I make that is not smooth and easy would make a whiplash situation, and the guys on the end, the tail end Charlie, so to speak, and he'd been there himself, so he knew that. He practiced over and over, just making smooth turns and whatnot. He was a very dedicated pilot. The landing, though, the only real recall I have of that was I was just so pleased to get on the ground, because we came in about an hour after everybody else because of limited power and speed and that sort of thing.
Was it dark?
I have no recollection.
Don't remember.
I have the times on the sheet someplace, but I don't, in my mind, I don't have it.
Yeah.
That was the ship we flew, was a white cargo that day, incidentally, that I remember.
Did you, I know you encountered flak every time.
Every well, except the Royan, we didn't get flak.
What?
The French mission that I
Mhm.
talked about, there was no flak, and I'm surprised because that's what we're basically were there for, to knock out big guns.
Mm-hmm.
But evidently something was, I don't know what happened. The Germans didn't fire at us that day.
Did you ever encounter fighter pilots?
On our second mission, we as a crew had fighters. It's rather interesting. That was the mission to Durban in Germany, which was fuel storage, just as I recall, south of Berlin. And rather interesting thing happened there. It's pretty vivid, of course, because at that point I had never seen a B-17 shot down. We turned again, the turn-in from the North Sea was just to the west of Heligoland into Germany. And as soon as we cleared the coast, below us, probably 500 feet, I saw these cannon bursts below us, puffs, and they were going right behind us, but behind us and maybe 500 feet below us. Bing, 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 and I was on the verge of telling the pilot, said, "Hey, let's change our vector point, our direction, our compass point a little bit, so they wouldn't creep up on us." And about that time, the whole group switched, so somebody had already alerted that there was trailing cannon fire. Okay, the point I'm saying that was so unusual was that the 390th bomb group was right on our heels. I don't know if they had made a short turn or we had made a long turn or what, and they had caught up with us. And I could see them very vividly back there. And as soon as they cleared the coast, this anti-aircraft battery tracked them, and they had their altitude then exactly. And they knocked down 4 planes. It bang, 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 just, and those planes went down just like rocks. And I said to myself, this can't be. You can't knock down a big plane like that quickly and that easily. But I saw that battery, which had to be a mobile battery because they knew where all the flak areas were on the big towns. It had to be a mobile battery. It knocked down 4 planes immediately. And that day, the Luftwaffe was up in force, and so because that 390th was already disrupted, they started picking on them, and they lost, as I recall, from our later research, 9 planes that day. And the odd thing as I bring all this up was that all the historians are saying that they lost all those planes because of fighter attacks. And I know for a fact that 4 of them went down from flak. And I passed that information on to the 390th historian a while back. I don't think they were impressed. Very small bit of information. It meant nothing to them, but all the historians of record have always said that the fighters got those 9 planes.
Mm-hmm.
But back to your original question. Yeah, we really weren't bothered by fighters that day in our squadron. Other squadrons were in our group. But shortly after that disruption of the flak, there was this FW-190 that started flying off of our 9 o'clock off of our left wing, and he was just sitting out there. And so I had spotted him and called him out to the crew, and finally he turned into us, turned his wing in, and I have to speak poorly to our own training, because as a green, never been shot at before gunner, this guy turned in and his whole wing lighted up. And I said, what in the heck is he turning his landing lights on for? It took me, I don't know how many seconds, till I finally said, no, he's shooting at us. They'd always told us, hey, how to shoot at them, but they had never told us those guys were going to shoot back. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And it was a startling revelation to me to say, hey, his landing lights on. But anyway, what I know, it had to be one of those big FW-190s that was loaded with oversized guns, the 30s and 40 millimeter guns that would try to bust up a formation with cannon fire rather than machine gun fire, which they had a few of those. And he was operating as a Lone Ranger, if you will, so that makes me think more all the time that it was one of the, I've forgotten the name they used in Luftwaffe for that type of gun, but that type of plane. But it was an FW with big red spinner. I remember that big red spinner and the lights coming clear across the wingspan of his plane. But we all fired at him, and he went away. And we didn't get hit anymore by fighter attacks, because I'm sure they started concentrating on the 390th bomb group.
You mentioned that in your training that you trained to do some air-to-ground firing. Did you ever use that training in practice as a secondary target, or?
In practice, we never had to use it, period, because all of our firing was at moving targets in the air.
Mm-hmm.
And the opportunity to shoot at ground targets, I think, was more just an opportunity to get us acquainted with shooting at a target from a moving airplane. You know, there are different ways of going about it. You shoot from stationary positions on the ground at a stationary target. Then you get in a moving a moving transportation at a stationary target. Then you get in a moving vehicle at a moving target. So, you know, you had all these various things they wanted to acquaint us with. Back in training, to recycle to that, one of the things we did in training was get on a moving truck and go through a trap pigeon area, and then as we'd move down the road in this moving truck, they'd throw out clay pigeons at us, and we were shooting at them with 12 gauge shotguns and whatnot. And that was just another phrase of trying to teach a gunner how to lead into a moving target. There is a specific
Great,
way that
yeah.
there's a pursuit curve that they called it back in those days, that a plane had to fly unless he was coming directly into you, that he had to fly, and as a consequence at different angles that he approached you as on this pursuit curve, you gave less and less deflection, and you gave a big lead in the early 90-degree phase, and in the zero phase of approach, you gave no deflection.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the question
Yeah,
that
it
you're
is.
interested
Yeah,
in?
thanks. It just, when you told me that there was a practice, I thought, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense if you're flying at 10,000 feet, as your
It
normal
was just
flyer.
an opportunity to give us a chance to operate our
Yeah.
guns.
Yeah, I
You
get
know, it was just a gradual acquainting.
Yeah. I know that fighter pilots had secondary targets. They'd go in, lead the mission, protect y'all, and then on the way back, they'd have other things that they'd pick out.
Well, that was only in the latter part of the war that they were released to do that. And when Doolittle came in to command the 8th Air Force in January 1st of 1944, he changed a lot of things. And that was the type of coverage that the fighters would allow, would be ordered to do, because at one time they would stick very, very closely to the planes, the bombers.
Mm-hmm.
Later he released them to fly cover, if you will, and seek out the Luftwaffe as they gathered to stop them before they attacked, if you will. So it was a different strategy that they used. And then after they got more and more air superiority, and Luftwaffe lost its better pilots, and they had fewer fuel opportunities, and they would release certain fighter groups to go strafe, and they would do that. Of course, they in the 9th fighter group, that was their purpose anyway, was to support the ground troops. So,
Yeah.
each group had a specific function.
When was your 13th mission?
Be the 18th of April, 1945. That would be the last one we went on officially. Without having my record here, I can't even tell you the name of it at the moment.
So,
But I've got, and in my crew history I wrote, I've got that all pretty well detailed as to dates and who did what.
so that became your last mission. Was there anticipation that you would fly more? And the call just didn't come?
Well, they knew that they had Germany on the ropes. In fact, there were people in London that were saying the war was going to be over at Christmas of 44, excuse me. Well, they underestimated, they underestimated tremendously that, because the Germans were worthy opponents, they weren't going to give
That
up
was the
easily.
bulge too, and
Well, the bulge then was started on December 15th, and they made a tremendous bulge, as you called it, and everybody calls it. All their intention was to get into the I've forgotten the port they were directed themselves to, but they wanted to get into that and cut off the British Army, if you will, headed by Montgomery, basically from Patton's army in the south. And they were going to divide the armies, and they almost did it. One of their problems, of course, was they ran out of fuel for their tanks. One of our problems was that it was such bad weather we could give our people on the ground fighter support, air support. And so they were almost very successful in cutting our armies in two. Montgomery was there with the British, I've forgotten what they called it. It seemed like Ninth Army maybe. And Bradley was also in that northern area with Montgomery. Patton was on the south of the Bulge. And of course that's another ground war that was written up tremendously by many people. But they finally were able to get clear weather again, and they closed the Bulge and drove the Germans back, and that was one of the Y's in the road that Hitler made, and he used up a lot of his reserves, his tank reserves, his people, his ammunition and whatnot, and it made it a lot easier, if there's such a word, for our own ground troops to go ahead and forge ahead. But that was a basic mistake, but he nearly pulled off a real maneuver that would have been difficult to handle. The port he was shooting for just escapes me right now, but it was the one just to the west of Antwerp. But it won't come to me. I don't think it was Le Havre, but in that area.
May the, 6th or 8th?
May the 8th was official day. Official day. That it was delayed a day because the Russians wanted to have a ceremony of their own. The dues got out, I think, that Germany had quit on the 7th, as I remember. And then officially the VE Day became the 8th.
Do you personally recall that day?
I do in a limited way. We were on base, of course, so we weren't flying that day. In fact, all flights had been canceled except by special permission. And when VE Day was established, we, as enlisted men, were, and I'm sure many officers, were forbidden from leaving the area. We couldn't go in to town, we couldn't do this sort of thing. So we stayed on the base totally. All these big celebrations they had in London and New York and whatnot, there had to be tremendous crowds involved in that, including military and everybody else. The pictures I've seen of those were just enormous masses of people that were in there on that day. We on the base, as I say, it was a very quiet thing. Evidently there was a lot of shooting of flare guns and 45s and whatnot, but our crew didn't get involved in that sort of thing, and we just happy to be on the ground.
Yeah.
It wasn't anything spectacular for us, other than it was another project, another benchmark, I guess. The war in Europe was over, and that was a relief to us. But it was no immediate celebration that we were able to do.
How long did y'all stay in England before you actually headed?
Well, that is something I think a lot of study ought to be made of. That was a time of tremendous indecision and turmoil and personnel turnover and whatnot. I've seen very little written about, and I've looked for information. And I speak to that as on a personal agenda, because in the beginning, the intention was that some people would go back and be retrained for 29 B-29 plane projects and sent to the Pacific. And apparently the 100th Bomb Group was to be assigned as a group to be sent to the Pacific to go against the Germans. This was in the early, before VJ Day. And they had moved a lot of, as I understood, they had 100 brand new B-17Gs stationed at Munich with that intent in mind. They were re-equipping all those planes with radar units, so all of them, or most of them anyway, would have radar units instead of just the lead planes. And I know I helped on the flight line as one of my projects, as I wasn't flying much. They put me out to helping to move radar equipment into the radio cabin. But there was a great deal of indecision about that, and as a result, that many of the top brass were immediately being sent back to the States. And as a consequence, even the ground crews were being sent back. The old ground crews had been over there a couple of more years and whatnot, and all the decisions on an enlisted man personnel movement was supposed to be based on the point system. And I'm sure you've heard of that, and you get points according to the length of time in service, the length of time overseas, certain medals. Married people got certain points and whatnot, and so each person had a point system that somebody added up, and you had that, and that was supposed to be the rotation device that was used to determine when you went back home or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
That was rather loosey-goosey, as it turned out. Again, at the preference of the armed forces, they did what they wanted to do, what it boiled down to. And I again speak from personal experience. Our first guy that left was our waist gunner, who had been transferred over as a spare gunner. He was the first one that was sent home, and he was sent home specifically to be trained as a 29 crew personnel. He said he either on the way home or shortly thereafter, he was supposed to be sent to Santa Ana, California for training. The war in Japan was over, and so he was given 30 days leave at home and discharged. I've heard other stories just like that. I talked to Al Lacra, who was a radio man on another crew that I know, and he had the same exact experience. He was supposed to be going over for 29 training. He was able to fly back, as I recall, was one of the crew's top commanders, and he went over there, and the same thing exactly happened to him. So there was a program to equip 29s with experienced people. Some of us were then supposed to go over to Japan with this B-17 assembly group. But as things developed, the all the head offices within the organization started turning over, and men were promoted and changed into those positions. And the same thing was true in the orderly rooms and every place else. And the nobody knew, as enlisted men, knew what was going on. And all we heard were rumors, that somebody was going to fly out the next day and somebody was going to get on Queen Mary and this sort of thing. But it was strictly rumor by rumor basis. Our individual crew, our armament man was the first one to leave, and they sent him to London with the idea they were going to put him on a boat and send him back home. And this was after VJ Day. He went down there, and he was evidently left there in limbo for several weeks because he came back and visited us 2 or 3 times. The other men, the top turret man and the radio man, then had that same experience. They were shipped to someplace on the south ports and shipped home. In my particular case, one of the gunners who had been assigned to our new crew, which was Cullimore, was the pilot. He was assigned there as a ball turret gunner because we were no longer a lead crew. And he and I ended up with the same number of points. And there we were the last ones more or less around, and they ended up to get us off the rolls because they were trying to close that base. Get us off the rolls, they sent us over and assigned us to the chemical department on the base. But it was just a paper function. So we were there in that place in an empty barracks again. It's amazing how many times I ended up in a totally empty barracks. But to make a long story short, one morning there at around the 1st of November, he was told to get his bags ready. He was going to ship down to London and become a switchboard operator. Well, that was another paper transaction, of course. And he did. And I was still around. And one morning around, and I'd have to look at my records to see the exact date, but around the 10th of November, 1945, I was told I was going down to Portsmouth on the Channel. And just bang, be ready the next morning sort of thing. And no information about what or where or when. I got down there at Portsmouth, and eventually I was told that I was going to be sent to Germany, in which I was loaded on a Channel freighter of some kind, a military boat, with a lot of new recruits from the States, and I was sent to a camp in southern France, on the coast of France there. And I think it was Philip Morris, but I'd have to look at my records again to know. And I was kept there for 2 or 3 weeks, and apparently it was a reassembly place, and at that point I was staff sergeant, so I was the head non-com for a group of about 12 gunners that had little or no flying experience in missions, and I was to take them to Frankfurt, Germany. And so they sent me to a point, and I took these guys, and they didn't have any place, any orders for us. So we were tacked on to a new bunch of guys in infantry to their troop train. And they had no cargo trains for them, no boxcars, if you will, for us. So they gave us a caboose. They threw in a bunch of straw in there for sleeping, and they threw in a big barrel and gave us some charcoal and coal and whatnot for fire. And right in the middle of December, there we were going across France and Germany, and snow on the ground, and it was colder than heck. So we never got out of our clothes for about 3 days on that trip into Frankfurt. We got into Frankfurt and were able to clean up at that air base there. And at that time, then, I might mention one little aside there. All the guys wanted to go in town and said, okay, we'll try that. So I didn't know where I was going. We went into town and saw this German beer garden. It was underground, if you will. It wasn't on the ground level. So we walked in, sat down at the table, and eventually, after we got a beer, I looked around and there was not another soldier in there any place. It was all German civilians. And I said, guys, we got to get out of here, because there must have been 200 German civilians down there. And I said, we need to get out of here. And so I think without even finishing our beer, we left, because we weren't armed, we weren't anything. So we had just exposed ourselves to potential problems. Of course, the German population by that time weren't ready to cause trouble, I'm sure, or we would have been mistreated down there. We got out of there. But they then put us on German passenger trains, which were well equipped. They were smooth riding, well organized. By that time, they sent us up to Kassel, Germany. And as soon as I got there, the people at the receiving point said, what are you doing up here? He said, we're going to put you on the list to go home. So I don't know to this day exactly why I was sent to Germany, except two reasons. They needed the non-com to take these new recruits over there, or it was just a paper mess up. Just one of those paper trail problems. Mm-hmm. I don't know to this day why, and nobody else had that experience except me. So I think it was just a case that they needed a non-com. But so we went to Kassel, which was a very well-equipped base by that time. And they were supervising, among other things, a lot of POWs. And one of the things that they did was they would gather up these POW German soldiers, and they'd take them out to the woods and cut firewood all day for the stoves, because it was still wintertime and very cold. And so eventually then I didn't have any particular duties at all there while I was there. And after 2 or 3 weeks or so, incidentally, at that base, they had German Fräuleins that would serve us in the mess halls. They were getting things organized over there real good by that time. Anyway, eventually I was put in charge of this boxcar of American soldiers, and I don't know how many we had in there. It wasn't the 40 and 8 type of thing, but probably 20 guys. And they were the ground troops that were in that base area. And we went then into Le Havre, I think it was, in about a 3-day trip through Belgium and France. And on every stop we made, there would be these civilians that would try to trade us something for cigarettes. Cigarettes were highly in demand. and I didn't usually do that, but that one time I was sitting there just hanging out the door, and this civilian walked up. He wanted to give me a jackknife for one cigarette. And I said, okay, I didn't smoke anyway myself, so it was no big deal to me, but bartering for cigarettes was a big function. So I took, it was just a plain knife, really, a pocket knife, nothing spectacular. But I have that to this day, and my son has it for safekeeping now. But anyway, got into Le Havre, and that base was really equipped, and they had PXs and ice cream and everything else. So eventually we were loaded onto a Liberty boat manned by a French fleet crew, and in 17 days of that trip we landed in New York Harbor, and we came in, as I guess was pre-organized, in the morning, because they didn't want us to come in there at night, I'm sure, with strange crews. We landed, and all this hoopla that people would say, well, I didn't get greeted in parades, and all these people break.
Stop here for a break. Okay, we'll just restart it, and well, go ahead, take a drink of water.
My throat is dry.
That's all right.
We weren't greeted by the famous parades and banners and bands and all that sort of thing that so many, especially Vietnamese troops, lamented their fate about. We did have a Red Cross trailer there, and had 2 or 3 American women that passed out coffee and donuts to us. And I remember that very vividly, that the Red Cross was there. And other than the Red Cross ladies on our base back in England, that was the only contact I ever had with the Red Cross in my career, my military career. But we then were sent immediately to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and fed tremendously well at their mess halls there, with steaks and outstanding military, non-military food, if you will. And they treated us very kindly there. From Fort Dix, we were all assigned then to the various discharge centers we were to go to, which we were supposed to be sent to the closest one to our present hometown. And in my case, that was Fort Sam Houston, and we were put on trains and passenger trains, and I was sent to Fort Sam Houston and discharged there after 2 or 3 days.
And what was your discharge date?
I was discharged effective the 6th of February, 1946.
Ah, okay.
I
wrote the number down wrong over here.
One of the things, well, I may have told you wrong. One of the things that I remember about my discharge there, two things specifically. I had a brand new 45. We had been issued 45s to fly with and whatnot. And apparently I was issued one, and no record was ever made of it, and I had a brand new 45, and I brought that all the way back from with me back home. And at that point, I didn't want to have anything to do with the military, and I'd been checked out, this almost the last goodbye, and I'd walked through the last place of importance for the discharge, and I'd walked clear through there, and I walked back about 25 yards and had this 45, and I just threw it in the pile. I just didn't want it. And it kind of goes along with the other thing I did, which was foolish also. When I was over at Kassel, Germany, I had my A2 jacket that I had bought myself while I was in Thorpe Abbott. And I gave it to the guy who was roomed with me. There's a guy from Mississippi. I've never heard from him since and didn't know him before. And I said, "You want this?" I said, "I don't want this anymore." So I had a very, very bad attitude about the way I'd been handled. The last several months I'd been in the military. And when they asked me as I was checking out at Fort Sam Houston if I wanted to be in the reserve, I said, no way. I wasn't going to have anything to do with the military from then on because I had no rank of any consequence, and I knew I wasn't going to go in the military as an enlisted man in any shape, size, or form.
Yeah.
And so that was my attitude about when I checked out. My mother had heard I was back in the state, and she had a brand new Ford, and she came down there and picked me up. She was living in Midland, Texas at the time, and she came back and picked me up and took me into Midland. And on the way back to Midland with this brand new car, the Highway Patrol stopped us right outside Comfort, Texas, and wanted to know where we got that car. So I don't know till yet. They just wanted to look at it, or they wondered why anybody had a brand new car in the first part of 1946. Was they had just started rebuilding cars for the civilians at that point.
Instead of making liberators, they started making cars again, huh?
Right on. Right on. Right on. So anyway, that generally was my military history, which was uneventful other than the missions I flew, but most of my recollection was that most of it was at the convenience of the government.
Always.
Always.
So, you've come back, you're released from the military, you refused to go in the reserve, so what did you do?
Well, my intention was to go back to get my degree at university. As I said, I had been discharged in early February, and so that was not a time to go back to school. So at that time, my dad was in charge of Sharp Drilling Company drilling rigs, and so I'd ask him if I could have a job out there working on one of the rigs till summer school started. And he said fine, and of course men were still hard to get. I had the experience. So I worked on a steam drilling rig out at Kermit, Texas, which is right on the border of the New Mexico, Texas panhandle, for several weeks. And one of the things I remember there, it was strictly a oil field town, had been always. It was a place that Roy Orbison came from, the folk singer, Western folk singer. Mm-hmm. But one of the guys that I got to know real well and had known from 1941, he had worked on the rigs that I worked on in 1941 in the Rincon field in the Valley of Texas, was Rex Robertson. And I got to reacquaint with him because they had sent him overseas to the Pacific in the Seabees. So that was a very good assignment for oil field people because they had all this different training that would equip them very well for heavy equipment operation and hard work. So anyway, I then, after several weeks working there on that rig, making a few bucks. The rate of pay, if I might bring that up, had changed immensely. When I was in 1941, before the war, I was making 75 cents an hour, working on a drilling rig and furnishing our own transportation and everything else. They had just passed the law that they had to start paying time and a half, though over 40 hours. And they had just, in those days, started collecting Social Security out of your check. And I know that each check I had, they would take $4 out each time in the beginning in 1941. They're now taxing me for that same money that I put in. Anyway, back to the point. You asked me about what did I do immediately after. I went back. Instead of going to the University of Texas, I wanted to go back to the University of Oklahoma, where my parents were living. Well, that's another story. But my sister was going up there at the time, and so I decided I wanted to go there rather than Texas University anyway. And so I went up there and enrolled in pre-med this time. And that's what I enrolled in and ended up graduating in early January of 1948 with a BS degree.